It is now the top of the hour, and I would like to welcome everyone to the second of a four-part series of presentations that Reg and I are doing this week. This presentation follows yesterday's, where Reg laid out a little bit of history of organizations over the last 2,200 years, and I focused on some of the challenges or the assumptions that we make about organizations and change of those organizations, the assumptions that we often fail to consciously recognize, but actually impact the way we practice, the changes and how to influence organizations. In this particular session, we're going to go a little bit deeper, and we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday, and we're going to explore some of the challenges that are before us by looking at examples of other companies. The companies we're going to be looking at are a selection of some that Reg and I have studied. They are what might be called non-traditional organizations, in that they don't have just a traditional hierarchy. They may be a network structure, or it may be a traditional hierarchy with a network attached to it. So what we're going to focus on is what can we learn from these organizations that we might be able to then generalize, because what you will find is that none of the organizations really do everything exactly the same, and all have some limitations. In this particular presentations, we're going to see what we can learn and how we can actually apply that going forward in our thinking about organizational change and organizations themselves. So what we're going to be doing then is looking at the design of an organization that is capable of routine, proactive change, thereby minimizing the traditional reliance on episodic disruptive change, which most of our change models are built around. We're going to be looking at control to a large extent, because as we mentioned yesterday, when you look at organizations, the traditional hierarchy is really built more for control than it is built for getting work done. And the control is necessary, but there's alternate ways to think about how you can control an organization. We're also going to be looking at empowerment to some extent, which is within the control element. And that oftentimes we think about empowerment as something that is granted to you by someone in authority. Rarely do we look at it as boundary testing. In this case, explicit granting of empowerment versus the implicit that it's there for your taking, and you're going to see that a lot in these organizational structures. Yesterday, we left off with the core requirements for the organizations of the future as we see them. First off was the autonomy and an action orientation. This is an independence of leadership across the organization, but also a tendency toward action versus a tendency toward getting approval from someone else. We're talking about responsiveness. This is a customer-facing responsiveness that is not only to external customers, but internal customers, that has some tension built into it with purpose. One of the areas of control is to basically keep the organization from flying apart if you make individual parts responsive for taking their own action. So if you release the passions of some people throughout the organization, then you also have to find a way to bring them back to a purpose to keep them cohesive. This also then requires some alignment through the cross-organizational linkages and how that can be accomplished outside of the traditional communication up, across, and then down between silos. We're also now going to be jumping into what are some of the alternate pathways for how to design organizations and how they structure. The requirements for the organization then. Drilling down into more detail, let's look at responsiveness. In this case, I'm using the cat video. Figure all presentations at some point need some cat, but this really fits pretty well. I'm talking about responsiveness from an agility, but I'm hesitant to use agility because it means so much in so many different ways in different contexts today. What we're really talking about is the focus and the responsiveness to a purpose and how that is accomplished in an organization. This then requires an obvious customer-facing responsiveness, and again, not only to the external customer, but to the internal customers. To accomplish this, there is a need for line of sight for individual jobs to the organizational outcome. This is one of the key things that comes up repeatedly in HR activities, is how to connect people to the work and the purpose of that work. This often is difficult, but we're going to see in some of the examples this morning that there are easy ways of doing it that companies are doing on a regular basis. We're also talking about the direct lines of communication, having organizational transparency and eliminate a lot of the filtering and handoffs that happen throughout the organization. Too often, what happens in organizations that is information is really situational at that particular place of work, and it gets pushed up into the organization for a response.
Okay. Ross, has the slide frozen again?
Don't know. You should be seeing the bottom of avoid filtering.
No, we're still on alternative pathways.
Oh, let's see. It's frozen. Okay. Share. I think there's too many people homeschooling in the neighborhood. Reg, are we back to slide one?
No, there's nothing yet. It just says it started screen sharing, but it hasn't said what. You haven't got anything on there.
Oh boy. It says starting screen share.
I just love technology when it works.
I know. Let me go ahead and start walking through it. And I'll try to pull up the bullet points a little sooner and see if the screen will catch up to my voiceover.
Yep.
And let me jump to slide 4.
Yep, that's coming up.
Okay. Slide 4 then is looking at the requirements that we need. First off was the autonomy we talked about. This gets into the timely decision-making in the organization that oftentimes is slowed down through the traditional hierarchy, the control, the filtering of information, the lack of connections between parts of the organization, and the dependence upon using the hierarchy for decision-making as well as communication. We're also talking about now principle-based decision-making. We focus on this because when you try to release people to be independent, they need some guidance of how to make the decisions because they're no longer under the control of their management structure. So the key then is how to make decisions within some principle structure so that they have got that necessary guidance. For autonomy also, people have to act in consultation with others. And if the risk is affordable comes from effectuation that we talked about yesterday, and you're going to see it in a couple of the examples today. We're also talking then about organizational sense making, how that sense making can be distributed across the organization and not just in key parts of the organization, such as a planning department or the executives themselves. This then also gets into effectuation thinking about the entrepreneurship spirit and how to keep that type of spirit alive after the organization starts getting big beyond the ability of a single person to really control it. Shifting to slide 5 then, we're now looking at the cross linkages necessary in an organization for an alignment. part of this addresses the boundary decisions and the clarity of the decision rights across those boundaries. Traditional hierarchies manages that for people, but once you go to a distributed structure, then there needs to be some type of clarification for that. This requires some minimal structure for direct communication, such that people are communicating without necessarily getting too bogged down with having to communicate with people that aren't necessary. This also further requires some integration for purpose alignment. Purpose alignment traditionally is within the control of the hierarchy, but once you get out of a hierarchical structure, then alternate ways need to be brought into place. And some persistence of what is often avoided. Too often organizations spend majority of their time firefighting, and they run into problems, both strategic and operational problems, because they're not focused on where the organization needs to go. This is what you might say, the 20% that adds the 80% of the value, but it's the firefighting that pushes out the ability. So we need some persistence of how to keep focused on what needs to be focused with some clarity, but not let it interfere with the people that are doing the work. This requires then some focus on functions of the organization and how those functions are carried out. 6 for slide. See, the question then comes is, how do we attain such an organization? And more importantly, what can we learn from some of the non-traditional organizations that are successfully using either a network structure or a hierarchy with it, maybe a network attached to it? And then what are the design elements that are associated with that, so that we can generalize and figure out how can we then organize for work and not for control. This requires then an examination of structure, the relationships among the people in the organization and the processes, as well as organizational behavior, which may be called culture, but culture, again, is often used in multiple ways. So we want to just simplify it as the behavior of people within the organization.